leap in a Nevada mountain, men clawed silver from the earth in a deafening, dusty frenzy. Just a few years later, 1,000 miles east, champagne flowed in a marble ballroom overlooking the Atlantic. What possible thread could connect these two different worlds? The answer is the astonishing life of one woman, Theresa Tessie Fair Oelrichs, a Gilded Age widow who inherited a fortune ripped from those very mines and used it to crown herself Queen of America's most exclusive society. By the end of her story, you will understand the raw power of money to rewrite destiny and conquer a world that never wanted to let her in. This is a tale of shocking family scandal, of a love cut tragically short, and of a glittering war fought with party invitations in palace-sized cottages. How did a woman from the rugged West outmaneuver the ancient families of the East? What does it truly cost to buy your way into a world that considers you an outsider? When you think of ultimate power in the Gilded Age, whose name comes to mind first? To understand the empire Tessie would one day command, you must first meet the man who built it from nothing. Her father, James Graham Fair, was known to the world by a nickname that tells you everything: Slippery Jim. Born in Ireland, he arrived in America with little more than ambition and a knack for understanding the earth. His fortune, and therefore Tessie's destiny, was forged in a single, almost mythical place, the Comstock Lode in Nevada. This was not just a mine, it was a geological freak, a mountain of nearly pure silver so vast it defied belief. And Slippery Jim, alongside his partner John Mackay, held the key to its richest heart, a section called the Big Bonanza. The stories from the Comstock sound like tall tales, but they are true. At its peak, the Consolidated Virginia mine, which Fair and Mackay controlled, was yielding silver worth millions of dollars every single month. Picture train cars, not carts, leaving the mountain loaded down with raw wealth. This was industrial-scale alchemy, turning rock into staggering liquidity. Jim Fair's tactics were as hard as the ore he mined. He was relentless, a master of mining law and financial pressure, always sliding out of trouble and into greater profit, which is exactly how he earned that slippery reputation. He did not just find a vein of silver, he orchestrated the extraction of an entire kingdom's ransom. That fortune transformed him from an immigrant prospector into one of the wealthiest men in the United States, a bona fide silver king. But raw mineral wealth is one thing, social currency is another. The millions he piled up were wild Western money, fresh from the dirt and tainted by the rough world of speculation and hard labor. It was powerful, but it was not polished. This was the immense, complicated inheritance waiting for his children, a mountain of money that could open any door. Yet the very source of that money ensured the old families guarding those doors would look down their noses. Tessie Fair was born into this paradox, heir to a fortune that could buy continents, but raised in a world that questioned whether such new money could ever be truly clean. The silver dust from the Comstock Lode seemed to settle over everything, even a childhood spent in San Francisco's grandest mansions. Theresa Tessie Fair, born in 1871, was the baby of the family, arriving into a world her father's fortune had purchased but could not fully sanctify. While Slippery Jim was back in Nevada, scheming and extracting, his wife, Theresa Rooney Fair, faced a different kind of excavation. Her job was to dig her family out of the social mire of being merely new rich. San Francisco was a paradox, a city itself built on gold rush money, yet it had already developed its own whispered hierarchy. The fair fortune was too enormous to ignore, but its source was a topic of murmured conversation. It was mining money, loud and masculine, tinged with the grit of speculation and the suffering of men in dark tunnels far away. Theresa, the mother, understood that while her daughters could wear Parisian gowns, they would always, in certain drawing rooms, be wearing the invisible stain of the mine. So Tessie's early life became a study in contrast. Her home was a palace on Nob Hill, filled with European art and the latest mechanical conveniences money could buy. She and her sisters received the finest educations money could provide, with tutors and finishing schools meant to polish their accents and manners until they gleamed. Yet this was all a carefully constructed facade, a beautiful shell built over the unstable foundation of her father's reputation. Jim Fair was a ghost in their luxurious lives, a figure more often discussed in newspaper scandal sheets than seen at the dinner table. His business dealings were ruthless. His personal life became the stuff of public spectacle when Theresa Rooney Fair famously sued for divorce, citing his infidelity. For Tessie, the message was clear. Wealth could buy everything except respectability. It could purchase a mansion, but it could not force the old families inside to offer a genuine welcome. It could provide silks and jewels, but it could not silence the gossip about where the money came from. She grew up in a gilded cage, observing her mother's tireless, often frustrating, efforts to climb a social ladder that kept being pulled away. This was the profound lesson of her youth, that in America there were two types of currency, and the second, social acceptance, was infinitely harder to mine than the first. The scandal erupted not in whispers, but in screaming newspaper headlines. In 1883, Theresa Rooney Fair did the unthinkable for a woman of her station. She publicly sued her fabulously wealthy husband for divorce. The charges were not just dry legal terms. They were a spectacle of cruelty and betrayal that captivated the nation. She accused Slippery Jim of a long pattern of infidelity, of maintaining a separate household with another woman, and of profound, sustained cruelty that made their marital life unbearable. This was not a private sorrow, it was front-page fodder. Every sordid detail, every allegation of Jim Fair's drunken rages and neglect was printed for a hungry public to devour. In the court of public opinion, the Silver King was dethroned. The very ruthlessness that built his fortune now painted him as a monstrous figure in his own home. For polite society, which clung to a strict, if often hypocritical, code of appearances, this was the final proof. Jim Fair's money was not just new and loud, it was now morally suspect. He was officially disgraced, a pariah in the drawing rooms he had never truly cared to enter. His daughters, however, had no such luxury of indifference. Tessie was just 12 years old when her family shattered so publicly. Overnight, she and her sisters became the daughters of that man, the subjects of pitying glances and vicious gossip. They carried a double burden, the immense weight of his fortune and the even heavier stain of his disgrace. Their bank accounts were bottomless, but their social credit was bankrupt. This seismic event defined Tessie's understanding of power and vulnerability. She saw that wealth alone was a brittle shield, easily shattered by scandal. She learned that a woman, even a wife in a gilded cage, could wield a devastating form of power through the courts and the press. And most crucially, she understood that to survive, she would need to perform a kind of social alchemy her father never attempted, to purify the raw ore of the Comstock fortune and mint it into something utterly respectable, something beyond reproach. The divorce was not an end, but a brutal beginning, setting the stage for Tessie's lifelong mission to conquer the world that had rejected her father. The public disgrace of their father meant the Fair sisters could not afford to be merely rich. They had to become impeccable. By the late 1880s, Theresa Tessie Fair and her older sister, Virginia, known to everyone as Bertie, stood at the threshold of the most high-stakes marketplace in America, the season of debutante presentations and marriage proposals. Their combined inheritance was a legendary sum, whispered to be in the tens of millions, a figure so vast it seemed almost fictional. Yet this fortune was their only weapon in a silent war for redemption. Their mission was clear: to exchange a portion of this mineral wealth for something no mine could ever produce, an unassailable social position through a brilliant marriage. The scandal of Slippery Jim hung over them like a fog, making their search not a leisurely pursuit, but a desperate necessity. They were not just heiresses, they were salvage operators, tasked with rescuing the family name from the wreck their father had made of it. Society columnists watched their every move with a mix of awe and judgment, documenting their gowns, their travels, and every potential suitor who entered their orbit. The pool of acceptable candidates was both wide and shallow, encompassing the sons of other industrial titans, but also, tantalizingly, stretching across the Atlantic Ocean. For the very richest American girls, a new and glittering prize had emerged: a European title. A British duke or a German baron offered more than a husband. He offered a genetic seal of approval, a centuries-old name that could instantly bleach the stain of new money and fresh scandal. Bertie and Tessie were thus launched on a transatlantic circuit. From the ballrooms of New York to the country houses of England, their fortunes a beacon that attracted noblemen whose ancient castles often had crumbling walls and empty coffers. It was a trade, plain and simple, cash for coronets. Every introduction, every dance was a calculated step in this intricate negotiation. For Tessie, observing it all, the lesson was being refined. Money was a tool, and its highest use was not in buying things, but in buying people, and through them, a permanent place in a world that had once locked its doors. The man who would become Tessie's partner in this grand social project was not a prince, but in many ways, he was something better. Herman Oelrichs was a titan of the Atlantic. As the senior American representative for the mighty Norddeutscher Lloyd shipping line, he commanded a fleet of the fastest, most luxurious steamships crossing the ocean. His wealth was not dug from a chaotic mountain. It was built on the orderly, predictable rhythm of global trade and passenger travel. This was old world mercantile fortune, respectable and established. For the Fair family, still reeling from scandal, Herman represented stability itself. He was German-American, cultured, impeccably connected in financial circles, and carried a quiet authority that Slippery Jim's brashness had never approached. Their courtship was a quiet affair, a strategic alignment noticed and approved by society's gatekeepers. When Theresa Tessie Fair married Herman Oelrichs in 1890, it was hailed as a brilliant match. This was not a cash for coronet trade splashed across the gossip pages, but a powerful merger of two formidable American fortunes. Tessie's volatile Comstock silver was now anchored by Herman's steady shipping empire. Together, they formed a financial and social bulwark that seemed unshakable. For Tessie, it was a masterstroke. She gained a husband of immense prestige without the baggage of a desperate European aristocrat, and she gained a partner whose very presence declared that the fair money was now legitimate, sanitized, and ready for its ultimate purpose. The wedding was less a romantic fairy tale and more a corporate signing, a deal that secured the capital she needed to launch her true life's work. With Herman's name shielding her, Tessie Oelrichs could finally begin the audacious campaign she had been preparing for since childhood, not just to enter high society, but to dominate it. Newport, Rhode Island, was their chosen battlefield. In the early 1890s, Tessie and Herman Oelrichs planted their flag on a breathtaking stretch of oceanfront property called Ochre Point. This was not merely a summer home. It was a statement carved in stone and surrounded by sea. They commissioned the architectural firm of McKim, Mead, and White, the tastemakers of the era, to build a French chateau by the Atlantic, a palace they named Rosecliff. While the mansion itself would take years to complete, their presence was immediate and undeniable. Tessie understood that in the theater of high society, the stage was as important as the performance. With Herman's steady, respected fortune backing her seemingly limitless Comstock inheritance, Tessie launched a charm offensive of unprecedented scale. She was no longer a scandal-tinged heiress trying to buy her way in. She was Mrs. Herman Oelrichs, a young matron of impeccable means and dazzling personal gifts. And she had both the wealth and the will to outspend and outshine everyone. Her beauty was often compared to a Renaissance painting, with luminous eyes and a graceful figure that captivated artists and photographers. But it was her ambition, sharpened by childhood humiliation, that gave her beauty its potent force. She cultivated a reputation not for icy grandeur, but for a certain vibrant warmth. She was a brilliant conversationalist, remembered for making each guest feel uniquely interesting, a social alchemy more valuable than any silver vein. With this potent combination, the Oelrichs' ascent was meteoric. They secured a magnificent home on New York's Fifth Avenue, a necessary foothold for the winter social season. But it was in Newport where the real game was played, and here, Tessie's ambitions inevitably collided with the established queens of the resort. The undisputed monarch was Mrs. William Backhouse Astor, the original Mrs. Astor, whose famous 400 list defined the absolute limits of acceptable society. Her rule was traditional, austere, and rooted in old New York Dutch money. Then there was the brilliant and disruptive Mrs. Alva Vanderbilt, who had famously crashed the Astor gates through sheer architectural audacity, building the colossal marble house. Alva was a strategist, using her fortune as a battering ram. Tessie observed these women, the reigning queen and the revolutionary, and began to formulate her own third path. She would not rely solely on ancient lineage like Mrs. Astor, nor would she engage solely in Alva's confrontational spectacle. Tessie's strategy was one of envelopment, of creating a world so dazzling, so exquisitely entertaining, that the elite would have no choice but to crown her its center. The quiet shipping magnate and the miner's daughter were no longer just attendees at the ball. They were preparing to build a better one. Rosecliff would be her masterpiece, a weapon of soft power disguised as a summer home. To design it, Tessie and Herman turned to Stanford White, the most celebrated and scandalous architect of the Gilded Age, a man who understood that a house was not a shelter, but a setting for a specific kind of fantasy. White was famous for his theatricality, and Tessie gave him a singular directive: to create a Newport version of the Grand Trianon, the elegant retreat built for the mistresses of French kings at Versailles. The symbolism was deliberate and potent. She was not building a fortress to keep people out, like some of the other cottages, but a pleasure palace designed to draw the world in. The result was a symphony in white stone and delicate symmetry, a vision of French neoclassical perfection perched defiantly on the rugged New England coast. From the moment the foundation was laid, Rosecliff declared Tessie's ambition: she would live like royalty by the sea. The interior was an even more breathtaking declaration of intent. The heart of the home was its ballroom, a cavernous, glittering space that was, at the time, the largest in Newport. It could hold hundreds of guests beneath its soaring, ornate ceiling, a blank canvas awaiting her parties. But the true architectural marvel was the staircase. Stanford White designed a sweeping, heart-shaped double staircase that cascaded down into the entrance hall. This was no accident. Every guest who entered would be framed by this elegant, romantic curve, making their arrival a moment of theatrical presentation. It was a stage entrance built into the very bones of the house. The gardens, meticulously planned, stretched toward the Atlantic, offering vistas of the ocean as a permanent, priceless backdrop. Every detail, from the gilded moldings to the placement of the terraces, was calculated to facilitate one thing: magnificent entertainment. Tessie was not merely building a residence. She was constructing the ultimate venue, and in doing so, she was ensuring that the most coveted invitation in Newport would bear her name. Rosecliff was her permanent answer to every slight her family had ever endured, a monument so beautiful, so undeniably supreme, that it would force society to forget where the money came from and remember only who possessed the vision to spend it so perfectly. The legend of Tessie Oelrichs was not written in society columns, but in the white sand she had died for a single night. With Rosecliff complete, she declared war on Newport's old guard, not with a challenge, but with an invitation. Her weapon of choice was the party, elevated from social obligation to breathtaking, strategic spectacle. While Mrs. Astor ruled through exclusion and a carefully curated list, Tessie conquered through inclusion in a world of her own magnificent creation. She understood a fundamental truth: in a gilded age, the hostess who provided the most dazzling fantasy became the most powerful, and no fantasy was more audacious than the one she staged in the summer of 1904, an event that would be remembered simply as the White Ball. The concept was one of sublime, almost insane, monochrome perfection. Tessie issued a single, non-negotiable decree: everything must be white. This was not a suggestion for attire. It was a total immersion. The ballroom at Rosecliff was transformed into a glacial palace. draped in white silk and lit by thousands of white electric bulbs, a shocking modern touch. The flowers, massive arrangements of lilies and orchids, were all pristine white. The supper tables groaned under white delicacies, iced cakes and mouses and blancmange, served on white porcelain. The very beach below the mansion, visible from the terraces, was not spared. Workers had reportedly dyed the sand a gleaming white for the evening. Guests arrived to find themselves living inside a pearl. Men wore white tie, of course, but the women were visions in layered white gowns, their jewels limited to diamonds and pearls, the only stones deemed pure enough for the theme. The effect was otherworldly, a dreamscape where the usual gaudy colors of wealth were banished, replaced by a statement of such controlled opulence it felt regal. This was not a party, it was a coronation in a single hue. The white ball was more than a triumph of logistics, it was a masterstroke of social psychology. Tessie, by dictating the very color of the world for one night, established herself as the ultimate arbiter of taste. She was not following the rules of Newport society. She was writing new ones, and everyone clamored to play their part. The ball was the talk of two continents, a symbol of her absolute command over the summer season, where Mrs. Astor's power had been based on saying no, on the fearsome weight of her disapproval. Tessie's power flowed from her ability to say yes to a more extravagant, more exciting vision of what society could be. She did not challenge Mrs. Astor's throne directly. She simply built a shinier, more entertaining one right next to it, and watched as the court migrated. Tessie's reign was built on a generosity of spectacle. Her parties were legendary for their originality, a circus-themed gala with actual performers, a lavish dinner where miniature gold pipes filled with perfumed tobacco were given as favors. She made philanthropy fashionable, hosting benefits that were as much about the dazzling entertainment as the cause. Through this relentless, creative extravagance, she accomplished what her father's money alone never could. She made the Oelrichs name synonymous not with Comstock silver, but with the pinnacle of cultured celebration. The miner's daughter from San Francisco had not just entered the hallowed ground of Newport. She had replanted its gardens, repainted its walls, and rewritten its guest list. In the glittering echo of the white ball, a quiet but monumental shift occurred. The old queen's light began to dim, and a new one, reflected in 1,000 white diamonds, reigned supreme. Yet the very foundation of her glittering world remained a mountain of silver far to the west. In December of 1894, the man who had mined that fortune, James Graham Fair, died in San Francisco. His passing was not a moment of sentimental mourning for his daughters, but the final, complicated severing of a troubled legacy. The newspapers reported his death with a mixture of awe at his wealth and a lingering distaste for his character, a reminder of the scandal Tessie had worked so tirelessly to overcome. The settlement of his estate was a monumental affair, reflecting the sheer scale of the Comstock wealth. His fortune, estimated at over $40 million, a staggering sum for the era, was divided primarily among his 4 children. Tessie, Bertie, and their 2 brothers each inherited a share that instantly ranked them among the wealthiest individuals in the world. But for Tessie, this was more than a simple deposit into an already vast account. This was the moment the last tether to her father's direct control was cut. Through the careful structures of trusts and the solid partnership of her marriage to Hermann Oelrichs, Tessie gained unequivocal personal command over her portion. This was not money held in trust by a male relative, nor was it subject to the whims of a living father whose scandals could still erupt. It was hers, absolutely. This final inheritance transformed her financial power from impressive to sovereign. She was no longer just spending the Comstock fortune. She was its steward, its general. The capital that built Rosecliff and funded the White Ball was now under her sole strategic direction, backed by Hermann's steady resources. This solidified an independence few women of her time could claim. Her power was now threefold: the social brilliance she had cultivated, the respected partnership of her husband, and the unfettered control of a legendary mining fortune. She did not just live in a palace by the sea. She owned the very ground it stood on and the mountain that paid for it, a queen in every sense, answerable to no one. The glittering world Tessie had built rested on a partnership of profound stability. Hermann Oelrichs was her anchor, the respectable face of their combined empire, a man whose steady presence in the shipping world lent an air of timeless legitimacy to her dazzling social campaigns. Then, without warning, the anchor was gone. In the autumn of 1906, Hermann suffered a sudden and fatal heart attack. He was just 54 years old. The news sent a shockwave through the financial centers of New York and the drawing rooms of Newport. For Tessie, the personal loss was profound, but it was compounded by an immense and immediate practical crisis. Her husband, her partner, the co-architect of her social reign, had vanished in an instant. The question on everyone's lips, spoken in hushed tones behind gloved hands, was a brutal one. What now? In the Gilded Age, a woman's legal and financial identity was often entirely subsumed by her husband's. A widow could be left with a generous allowance, but little real control. Her fate decided by male trustees and executors. All eyes turned to Hermann Oelrichs' will, a document that would determine whether Tessie remained a queen or was reduced to a pensioner in her own palace. The terms of the will were stunning in their simplicity and their power. Hermann Oelrichs left his entire estate, every share of the shipping line, every property, every dollar of his immense and respectable fortune, directly and solely to his wife. There were no restrictive trusts, no committees of bankers to oversee her decisions. In a single legal stroke, Tessie's already vast wealth from the Comstock Lode was now fused with the entirety of Hermann's maritime empire. The merger was complete. She was no longer Mrs. Hermann Oelrichs, the social hostess. She was Theresa Fair Oelrichs, widow, and one of the wealthiest individuals in the United States. Full stop. The scale of her fortune was now almost incomprehensible. A river of money fed by both the silver mines of Nevada and the steamship lanes of the Atlantic. This transformation redefined her in the public eye. She became the Gilded Age widow, a figure of immense fascination and power. The tragedy had stripped away the last layer of shared authority, leaving her standing alone at the pinnacle, the sole commander of a financial fleet. The quiet, steady partner was gone, and in his place stood a woman with the means to answer one final, daunting question. Could she rule alone? Alone at the helm of two colossal fortunes, Tessie faced a world that was both her playground and her proving ground. Widowhood in the Gilded Age often meant retreat, a quiet life of mourning on the sidelines of society. For Tessie, it meant the opposite. With no father or husband to answer to, she possessed a level of autonomy almost unimaginable for a woman of her time. She was the final authority on every decision, from the guest list for a Newport ball to the investment strategy for a shipping fleet. This freedom was intoxicating, but it was also a glaring spotlight. All of New York and Newport watched, whispering, waiting to see if the miner's daughter could truly manage empires. Managing her dual inheritance was a monumental task, a daily negotiation between two very different worlds. On one side was the volatile, legendary wealth from the Comstock Lode, a fortune built on geology and grit, still tied to the fluctuating value of silver and the complex trusts her father had left. On the other was the Oelrichs shipping empire, a modern, global business of steamships, schedules, and international commerce. Tessie had to be fluent in both languages, understanding the legacy of a mine shaft and the logistics of a transatlantic liner. She did not do this from a distance. By all accounts, she was a shrewd and attentive manager, working closely with lawyers, bankers, and the executives of the Norddeutscher Lloyd line. She was not merely collecting dividends. She was making strategic decisions, protecting her husband's legacy while ensuring her own financial sovereignty remained intact. This hands-on control defied every expectation of a society matron, and that defiance fueled endless rumor. A woman of such staggering wealth, unmarried and unchaperoned by a man, became a source of fascination and suspicion. Newspapers that once covered her parties now speculated on her business dealings. Was it seemly for a woman to command boardrooms? Could she possibly understand the complexities of mining stocks and shipping tariffs? Whispers followed her, suggesting that male advisors must truly be in control, or that her extravagant spending was a sign of financial recklessness. The scrutiny was a constant, low hum beneath the music of her parties. Every new purchase, every investment was dissected not just for its value, but for its propriety. She was navigating a narrow channel, expected to be both a brilliant hostess and a serious capitalist, while much of the world believed the two roles were fundamentally incompatible. Yet Tessie used this very scrutiny as a stage. She understood that her visible success was the only real rebuttal to the gossip. So she lived, not with reckless abandon, but with calculated magnificence. She continued to reign as the Queen of Newport from Rosecliff, her parties growing ever more creative, a signal that her fortunes were not just secure, but flourishing. She traveled extensively, a grand tour of Europe not as a sightseer, but as a peer. She became a formidable art collector and a serious philanthropist, endowing hospitals and charities with the same strategic eye she applied to her business holdings. In doing so, she performed a masterful balancing act. Her public life demonstrated the power and pleasure her wealth could create, while her private management proved its stability and growth. She was showing the world that a widow could be more than a caretaker of a legacy. She could be its dynamic, expanding force. The question was no longer whether she could manage her empires, but how far their influence and hers could possibly reach. Behind the white ballroom walls of Rosecliff, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. While her guests marveled at the ocean views, Tessie Oelrichs was reviewing reports from a world they would never see, a world of heiresses, timbering costs, and quarterly dividends. The Comstock Lode was not a distant memory. It was a living, breathing financial engine, and she was its chief executive. This was the stark, fascinating duality of her life. The Newport hostess was also one of the most significant female industrialists of her age, though few outside her circle of lawyers and trustees knew the full extent of her command. The mines her father discovered did not simply pay out a lump sum and go quiet. They were vast, ongoing corporate enterprises. Ownership was held in complex trusts and stock holdings, and these investments required constant stewardship. They were subject to the whims of the silver market, the depths of the veins, and the immense costs of keeping the tunnels safe and productive. Managing this was not a passive act of cashing checks. It was an active, demanding business. Tessie did not don a hard hat and descend into the shafts, of course. Her genius lay in strategic delegation and oversight. She employed the sharpest legal and financial minds in New York and San Francisco, men who understood mining law and corporate finance inside and out. She met with them regularly, poring over balance sheets and production reports. Her role was to set the strategy, to approve major decisions, and, most importantly, to protect the asset. She had to decide when to reinvest profits into new equipment, when to consolidate holdings, and how to navigate the Byzantine shareholder agreements that governed the Comstock's legacy. This was a world dominated by men who had made their fortunes with their hands and their ruthlessness, men like her father. Yet here was his daughter, 1,000 miles away, in silk and pearls, directing the fate of those very enterprises through intelligence and sheer force of will. The dividends that flowed east were not automatic. They were the result of her careful, calculated management. That river of silver capital paid for the roses at Rosecliff, the champagne at her balls, the armies of servants, and the Parisian gowns. Every exquisite detail of her Newport existence was underwritten by the gritty, dangerous labor of men in the dusty, dark depths of a Nevada mountain. It is a jarring contrast to hold in your mind the echo of pickaxes against rock and the delicate clink of crystal at a supper table. While Tessie entertained diplomats and dukes in a palace by the sea, the mines faced floods, cave-ins, and labor unrest. The wealth was not abstract, it was extracted, ton by brutal ton. She understood this connection intimately, not as a guilt, but as a fundamental fact of her power. Her ability to navigate both worlds, the sooty boardrooms of industry and the perfumed drawing rooms of society, was her ultimate triumph. It meant she was never truly dependent on anyone's approval or allowance. The frivolity of Newport was not evidence of a shallow mind. It was the dazzling output of a profoundly serious financial operation. She had mastered the alchemy her mother could only dream of. She had purified the raw ore of the Comstock into a currency of unquestioned social supremacy, all while keeping a firm, intelligent hand on the mine's throttle. The engine of her wealth never stopped humming, and because she understood its mechanics, neither did her reign. The immense wealth that flowed from the mines and the shipping lanes demanded more than just parties. For women of Tessie Oelrichs' station, philanthropy was not a hobby. It was a solemn, expected duty, a necessary counterbalance to a life of visible luxury. Tessie understood this social contract perfectly, and she approached charity with the same strategic brilliance she applied to her entertainments. Her giving was never anonymous, nor was it haphazard. It was a public performance of responsibility, a way to cement her legacy as a benefactor, not just a beneficiary. She became a formidable patron of medicine, endowing a children's wing at a New York hospital that bore the Oelrichs name, a permanent marble testament to her generosity. Her donations supported charities aiding women and children, causes considered appropriately feminine and morally sound for a society matron to champion. But her patronage extended beyond the expected. She was a serious collector of art, filling Rosecliff with old master paintings and Renaissance tapestries, supporting the artists and dealers of her era. This was cultural stewardship, an investment in beauty that would outlast any single season's gossip. Then, in 1914, the world changed, and the scope of her duty expanded with it. When the Great War erupted in Europe, the American Red Cross launched a monumental drive for funds and supplies. Tessie, like many elite women, threw herself into the effort. She transformed ballrooms into packing stations, turning her talent for organization from party planning to humanitarian logistics. She hosted benefit galas where the funds raised purchased ambulances and medical kits bound for the front. Her name appeared prominently on donor lists, lending crucial social credibility to the patriotic cause. This work added a profound new layer to her public image. It demonstrated that her fortune and her formidable energy could be mobilized for something far greater than social conquest. It showed a capacity for empathy and national duty that softened the harder edges of her ambition. In the grand ledger of Gilded Age life, philanthropy was the necessary credit that offset the debit of extravagant living. For Tessie, it was also the final, polished facet of her power, proving that the widow who ruled the mines could also heal, support, and sustain. But within this gilded family, a quiet, deeply personal drama was unfolding. Tessie's rise in Newport occurred in the long shadow cast by her own sister, Virginia Fair, known to everyone as Bertie. While Tessie was building Rosecliff, Bertie had executed what seemed, on paper, to be the ultimate social coup. In 1895, she married William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the original Commodore and a scion of one of the very richest, most powerful families in America. This was not just a good match, it was a legendary one. Bertie was no longer merely a fair heiress. She was a Vanderbilt, her name now woven into the foundational fabric of American aristocracy. Her position was instantly secure, her status unassailable. She lived in a series of Vanderbilt's monumental palaces, from a grand home on Fifth Avenue to the sprawling country estate, Idlehour. On the surface, Bertie had won the game they were both playing. She had the older, more respected name, the deeper roots in the Eastern establishment. So where did that leave Tessie, the younger sister? It left her with a burning, creative ambition to carve out a kingdom entirely her own. Newport became her answer. While Bertie's status was inherited through marriage, Tessie's would be built through sheer force of personality and spectacle. Their rivalry was never a public feud. It was a subtle, lifelong comparison conducted through architecture, guest lists, and newspaper columns. Bertie's strategy was one of assimilation. As Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt, Her role was to uphold and embody the dignity of that venerable name. Her social appearances were regal, correct, and somewhat reserved, reflecting the weight of her married legacy. Tessie, however, was building the Oelrichs name from the ground up. She could not rely on centuries of precedent, so she invented her own. Her strategy was one of dazzling innovation. Where Bertie might host a traditional dinner, Tessie would throw a themed ball that became the talk of the continent. Bertie had the Vanderbilt millions, but Tessie had the Comstock fortune fused with the Oelrichs empire, and she wielded it with a theatrical flair her sister perhaps did not need to employ. This divergence created two very different public personas. Bertie was the established queen, serene in her position. Tessie was the dynamic empress, constantly renewing her reign through fresh wonders. Was Tessie's Newport dominance driven by a desire to outdo her sister? It is impossible to ignore the psychology. For the younger sister, forever following in her siblings' footsteps, simply matching Bertie's Vanderbilt achievement was not enough. She had to surpass it in her own arena. She could not have the Vanderbilt name, but she could have the most celebrated house in Newport. She could not inherit an old social circle, but she could attract a more exciting, brilliant one. Every headline about a spectacular Oelrichs party was a quiet declaration of independence, a proof that she had not just entered high society, she had reshaped it in her own vibrant image. Their lives ran on parallel, glittering tracks, two sisters who had both traded a fortune for a title, yet chose utterly different paths to power. One found security in a legendary name, the other found supremacy in her own legendary creation. Yet the society pages buzzed with a persistent question: who would the richest widow in America marry next? In the years following Herman's death, Tessie's name was linked to a parade of eligible, often titled, bachelors. The most tantalizing rumor involved Prince Francis Joseph of Battenberg, a minor German royal whose family connections were impeccable. Speculation swirled that the prince, who had visited America, might be the perfect match to crown Tessie's social ascent with a genuine title. Other names floated in the gossip columns were men of immense wealth or political standing, each seemingly a logical piece in the puzzle of her legacy. The press treated her potential remarriage as a national sport, analyzing every male acquaintance who attended her parties, every European trip that might conceal a courtship. They could not comprehend a woman of such beauty and fortune choosing to remain alone, assuming she must be searching for a new anchor, a new partner to share the burden of her empires. This fascination revealed the era's limited imagination. A widow was expected to seek a new protector, to exchange her fortune for the security and status only a husband could provide. For Tessie, however, the calculations had changed entirely. She had tasted a sovereignty few women ever knew, complete command over two vast fortunes and the social kingdom she had built from them. A new marriage would inevitably mean compromise, sharing control, perhaps even ceding legal authority over her assets to a new husband. The prince, the tycoon, the senator, any of them would become, by law, the master of the Comstock mines and the shipping line. Why would she trade her undisputed throne for a shared scepter? The whispers about Prince Francis Joseph and others slowly faded, not with an announcement, but with a profound and telling silence. Tessie never remarried. This was perhaps her most powerful and subversive statement. In a world that defined women by their marital status, she declared that her independence was more valuable than any title, that control over her own destiny was the ultimate prize her fortune could buy. The mysterious bachelors were not suitors she rejected. They were options she never truly considered, because she had already won the game. Her lasting partnership was not with a man, but with the power she wielded in his absence. The world that had created Theresa Oelrichs was beginning to dissolve around her. The very first federal income tax was introduced in 1913, a quiet but seismic shift that signaled society's growing impatience with the unfettered accumulation of wealth. It was a philosophical blow to the Gilded Age's core belief that a person's fortune was entirely their own to display. Then, in 1912, a tragedy struck that resonated with terrible personal irony. The RMS Titanic sank into the North Atlantic, a disaster that shook global confidence in the age of steamship travel. For Tessie, the news carried a specific, chilling connection. Her late husband Herman's company, Norddeutscher Lloyd, was the chief rival to the White Star Line, which owned the Titanic. The catastrophe was not just a human tragedy. It was a stark reminder of the industry that underpinned her respectability, now shadowed by profound vulnerability. The public's fascination with the luxurious excess of the ship's first class, so similar to her own world, quickly curdled into a critique of the arrogance that such opulence could represent. The party was being questioned. By the late 1920s, the foundation started to crack in earnest. The wild speculation of the stock market, a game many of her peers played with abandon, felt increasingly unstable. The era of building marble cottages for a single summer season was seen as grotesque by a new generation shaped by war and emerging progressive ideals. The relentless extravagance that had been Tessie's weapon of social conquest was now viewed by many as a relic, a beautiful but foolish excess. She became, perhaps unwillingly, a living monument to a vanishing way of life. Her magnificent parties at Rosecliff continued, but they were now tinged with a sense of finality, like the last brilliant performance before a theater closes for good. The Gilded Age, which had given a miner's daughter the means to challenge queens, was fading into history, and with it, the specific brand of power she had mastered so completely. Rosecliff remained her sovereign territory, a stage that refused to lower its curtain, even as the world outside changed. Throughout the roaring 1920s, Tessie Oelrichs continued to reign from her French chateau by the sea. The parties evolved, trading the pure fantasy of the white ball for a different kind of glamour, one that reflected the new century's energy. She hosted dinners for pioneering aviators and celebrated authors. Her guest list a who's who of not just old money, but new fame. The jazz age echoed through her grand ballroom, and the terraces still buzzed with the conversations of diplomats, artists, and the occasional Hollywood star drawn to this living monument of a grander era. Yet a subtle shift was perceptible to those who knew her best. The spectacles were less about imposing a single, breathtaking theme and more about gathering brilliant people in a matchless setting. The magic was no longer in the dyed sand or the monochrome decree, but in the enduring perfection of the house itself. Rosecliff had become the star. Its heart-shaped staircase was the most photographed entrance in Newport, its gardens the most desired backdrop. To receive an invitation was to step into a preserved masterpiece, a testament to a philosophy of living that was rapidly disappearing. The house was no longer just her weapon of social conquest. It was her legacy in stone, a symbol of Gilded Age aspiration that had, against all odds, been fully realized. She maintained this palace with meticulous care until the very end, owning Rosecliff for over 3 decades. It stood, and still stands, as the purest expression of her life's work, a physical manifestation of the fortune mined from Nevada and spent so audaciously here on the Atlantic coast. In its echoing ballrooms and serene gardens, one can almost hear the ghost of an era, the rustle of silk, the clink of crystal, and the determined whisper of a woman who used beauty as a tool to build a kingdom all her own. The Roaring Twenties were in full swing, but the Queen of Newport was beginning to retreat from her own court. After decades of relentless social leadership, Tessie Oelrichs started to pull back from the public whirlwind she had so masterfully orchestrated. Her later years were marked by a quieter existence, a gradual withdrawal into the private world of her homes in a tight circle of friends and family. The woman who had commanded armies of servants and captivated hundreds with a single party now seemed to prefer the solace of her art collection and the familiar views from her windows at Rosecliff and her Fifth Avenue mansion. This was not a sudden disappearance, but a slow, dignified sunset after a spectacularly long day. The energy that had once fueled endless spectacle was now conserved, perhaps spent. In the autumn of 1926, Tessie traveled from Newport to New York City, checking into a hospital for what was described as a routine surgical procedure. Such operations were far more perilous in that era, even for the wealthiest patients. Complications arose in the days that followed, and on November 12, 1926, Theresa Tessie Fair Oelrichs died. She was 55 years old. The news resonated through the worlds of society and finance like a deep, final bell. The Gilded Age widow, the woman who had ruled the mines and conquered Newport, was gone. The official cause was listed as complications from surgery, a starkly medical end for a life defined by grandeur and will. Her death did not come as a shock of youth, but it felt prematurely quiet for a figure of such vibrant force. The aftermath was a matter of intense public interest, the final accounting of a legendary fortune. Her estate was a vast, intricate web of assets, and its valuation stunned even those accustomed to large numbers. Estimates placed its total worth between $30 and $50 million, a sum that translates to hundreds of millions in today's terms. This was the consolidated empire, the Comstock Silver, and the Oelrichs shipping interests, now to be divided. Her will revealed a carefully considered plan. The bulk of her estate was left in trust for her only child, her daughter, also named Theresa. Other bequests provided for relatives, loyal servants, and the charities she had long supported. Rosecliff, the heart of her social kingdom, was passed to her daughter. The distribution was orderly, a final demonstration of her lifelong command over the details of her wealth. There were no dramatic scandals or shocking disinheritances, just the calm, efficient transfer of a dynasty she had built and guarded. In the end, the fortune that had been ripped from a mountain in Nevada and sailed across oceans in steamships did not dissolve or disappear. It simply passed into new hands, leaving behind the empty ballrooms and silent gardens of a palace by the sea, a monument to the woman who proved that money, wielded with brilliant ambition, could buy a world. The reading of Tessie Oelrichs' will was a quiet event with thunderous implications. After a lifetime spent assembling and defending a colossal fortune, the document revealed her final strategic moves. Her primary heir was not the person many society observers might have predicted. The bulk of her estate, valued in the tens of millions, was left in a carefully structured trust for her daughter, Theresa, known as Tessie Jr. This young woman, then in her early 30s, became the new steward of the combined Oelrichs and Fair wealth. The trust ensured the capital remained protected, providing income while guarding against poor management or fortune hunters, a lesson perhaps learned from her own family's tumultuous past. But the will also contained a conspicuous and telling absence: her son, Herman Oelrich Jr. He received a specific, separate bequest of $1 million, a significant sum by any measure, but a mere fraction of the total empire. This stark disparity confirmed the long-whispered rumors of a profound estrangement. Herman Jr. had lived a life deliberately apart from his mother's glittering Newport world, and the legal document made that separation permanent and financial. The reasons for the rift remained private, locked within family memory, but its consequence was clear. The dynastic torch was passed to her daughter. The dispersal of her tangible treasures painted a picture of a life lived for beauty and display. Her legendary collection of jewels, those diamonds and pearls that had gleamed under the ballroom lights at the White Ball, were distributed among female relatives and friends, each piece carrying a fragment of her social history. Her extensive art collection, featuring Renaissance masters and Gilded Age portraits, was bequeathed to her daughter, destined to adorn the walls of Rosecliff and the Fifth Avenue mansion for another generation. The fate of the properties themselves was decisive. Rosecliff, her masterpiece and the seat of her power, was inherited outright by Tessie Jr. The New York City home remained in the family as well. These were not just houses. They were the crown jewels of her social kingdom, and she ensured they stayed within her direct lineage. So, did the fortune dissipate after her death? The answer is a fascinating no. It consolidated. While the immediate aftermath saw the usual settling of debts, taxes, and specific bequests, the core of the wealth, the mining trusts and the shipping interests, flowed into the trust for her daughter. Tessie Jr., now a tremendously wealthy woman in her own right, did not embark on a similar campaign of public spectacle. She lived a more private life, eventually marrying and having children, thus channeling the fortune forward. The Comstock silver, which had funded a social revolution, now settled into a quieter, more traditional role of sustaining a wealthy family dynasty. The explosive, creative force that was Tessie Oelrichs had been spent, but the engine of wealth she so expertly managed continued to hum, powering lives of privilege for decades to come. The fortune did not vanish into the gilded air. It simply retreated from the spotlight, its work of social conquest complete. The grand stage Tessie built outlived its creator, but its future was far from certain. After her death, Rosecliff passed to her daughter, Tessie Jr., who maintained the property for a number of years. Yet the immense cost and scale of such a palace made it a challenging heirloom. In the decades that followed, the shadow changed hands, moving out of the Oelrichs family and into an uncertain era where such extravagant summer cottages were seen as white elephants. Then, a global conflict gave the mansion an entirely new purpose. During the Second World War, the United States Navy took over Rosecliff. Imagine the transformation: sailors and officers walking the heart-shaped staircase where debutantes once made their entrance. The grand ballroom, built for orchestras and waltzes, likely served as a barracks or a planning room. The Navy painted the exquisite wood paneling a utilitarian gray, a stark, practical layer over Gilded Age gilt. This military interlude saved the house from decline, providing funds for its upkeep, but it also symbolized a profound shift. The age of personal palaces was truly over. When the war ended, Rosecliff faced a crossroads. Could it possibly find a role in the modern world? The answer came from an organization dedicated to remembering exactly the kind of world Tessie represented. In 1971, the Preservation Society of Newport County purchased Rosecliff. Their mission was not to freeze the house in time, but to actively revive it as a testament to a bygone era of American ambition. They undertook a meticulous restoration, peeling away the Navy's gray paint, repairing the delicate plasterwork, and returning the gardens to their original splendor. Today, Rosecliff is not a private home, but a public museum, one of the most visited in Newport. Thousands of people walk its halls each year, gazing up at the ballroom ceiling Tessie's guests once admired. But perhaps the most fitting twist in its story is its second life as a film set. The mansion's timeless, opulent beauty makes it a perfect stand-in for the fantasies of the past. Most famously, it served as the backdrop for Jay Gatsby's lavish parties in the 1974 film adaptation of The Great Gatsby. The irony is rich and perfect. The fictional Gatsby, a nouveau rich outsider who used spectacular parties to buy his way into a society that scorned him, found his cinematic home in the very palace built by a real woman who did exactly that. Tessie Oelrichs' stage, built for a single summer season's glory, now plays host to endless audiences and endless stories. The fortune that built it is gone, dispersed, but the monument remains, ensuring that the world she conquered will never forget the spectacle she created. Where does Tessie Fair Oelrichs stand in the grand gallery of Gilded Age heiresses? To understand her unique place, we must see her beside the other legendary women of her era, women whose lives followed a more traditional script. Consider Consuelo Vanderbilt, forced into a famously miserable marriage with the Duke of Marlborough to satisfy her mother's social ambition. Consuelo's story is one of a fortune traded for a title, of a young woman's life becoming a transaction to elevate her family's name. Her power was always borrowed, first from her father's railroads, then from her husband's ancient lineage. Then there is Jenny Jerome, who became Lady Randolph Churchill. Jenny was a brilliant socialite and a powerful political influence, but her identity and security were forever tied to the British aristocracy she married into. These women were satellites, their light reflected from the powerful men and institutions they were attached to. Tessie's story arcs in a completely different direction. She did not marry a duke or a lord. She married a respected American businessman, and when he died, she chose not to replace him with a title. Her crown was not borrowed, it was forged. What she achieved was something arguably more difficult and more distinctly American absolute social dominance built and maintained on her own authority, funded not by old Eastern money or a European coronet, but by the raw, volatile, industrial wealth of the American West. This is what sets her apart. Consuelo Vanderbilt had a palace in England, but it was Blenheim Palace, the seat of the Dukes of Marlborough. Jenny Jerome had the Churchill name. Tessie Oelrichs had Rosecliff, a palace that bore no name but her own, a kingdom where she was the sole monarch. Her power was not derivative, it was direct. The Comstock silver did not buy her a position in an existing aristocracy. It financed the creation of her own court, while other heiresses were negotiating for entry into old, rigid systems. Tessie was busy building a new, more dazzling system right next door and inviting everyone in. She represents a different archetype, not the heiress as diplomatic bride, but the heiress as sovereign entrepreneur of society itself. Her legacy is not a bloodline to a throne, but a blueprint for turning wealth into a personalized, irresistible cultural force. In the end, the miner's daughter from the West did not just join the elite. She redefined what elite could mean. The glitter of Rosecliff was paid for with a currency of dust and danger. To truly understand the empire Tessie Oelrichs commanded, we must look past the ballroom and back into the mountain, to the brutal reality of the Comstock Lode. Her father, James Fair, was a genius of extraction, but his genius came at a staggering human and environmental cost. The operations he and his partners ran were marvels of industrial engineering, yes, but they were also relentless machines that consumed men and landscapes. The environmental impact alone was apocalyptic. The mines required enormous amounts of timber to shore up the deep, unstable tunnels, leading to the deforestation of entire mountainsides around Virginia City. The extraction process used mercury to separate silver from ore, and this toxic runoff poisoned the local waterways, a legacy of contamination that lingered for generations. The earth itself was gutted, leaving behind a honeycomb of empty, precarious shafts, but the human toll was even more direct. The miners who descended into those depths faced a daily gauntlet of horrors. Cave-ins were a constant threat, with tunnels collapsing under the immense pressure of the mountain. Underground floods could drown a crew in minutes. The air was thick with silica dust, leading to a deadly lung disease miners called consumption, a slow, suffocating end. Wages were meager for the immense risk, and the work was backbreaking, with shifts that lasted 10 to 12 hours in perpetual, dusty darkness. James Fair's business tactics mirrored the harshness of the mines themselves. His nickname, Slippery Jim, was earned through ruthless financial maneuvers, squeezing out partners, manipulating stock, and leveraging every legal technicality to consolidate his control and maximize his profit. His fortune was not merely dug from the ground, it was wrested from a dangerous, exploited system. This presents us with an uncomfortable, modern question, one that echoes far beyond the Gilded Age. Can we, or should we, separate the breathtaking cultural achievements funded by such wealth from the often brutal means that created it? Tessa's world of white balls and heart-shaped staircases existed in a direct line of causality from the soot-choked tunnels of Nevada. Every silk gown, every orchestral note in her ballroom, every perfectly trimmed hedge at Rosecliff was ultimately purchased with the labor, and sometimes the lives, of men whose names history never recorded. This is not to diminish her personal accomplishments or her strategic brilliance, but to add a necessary layer of reflection. Her story is a quintessential American parable of transformation, of raw, wild capital being refined into social supremacy. Yet that raw capital was stained. The dazzling society life she built so masterfully was the final, polished product in a long chain of exploitation. It forces us to consider the hidden foundations of all great fortunes, the invisible weight beneath the glitter. We admire the palace, but do we acknowledge the quarry? Separating the real Theresa Oelrichs from the glittering myth requires sifting through a century of gossip and her own masterful stagecraft. The legend, of course, is the untouchable Newport queen, a serene figure of limitless wealth and flawless taste, holding court from her palace. The reality, glimpsed in private letters and the accounts of those who knew her best, reveals a far more complex and human portrait. One persistent myth paints her as a cold social calculator, a machine programmed to spend. Yet anecdotes suggest a woman of sharp wit and occasional fiery temper. A story from her later years involves a Newport neighbor, a man from an old family, who made a condescending remark about her Western origins within earshot. Tessie did not ignore it or respond with icy silence. She turned, fixed him with a look, and delivered a perfectly crafted, devastating retort that laid bare the hypocrisy of his own family's finances, leaving him stammering. This was not the action of a detached icon, but of someone who, despite her supreme position, still felt the sting of old slights and possessed the intelligence to answer them. Her generosity, too, was often personal, not just performative. While her large charitable donations were public, there were quieter acts. She was known to quietly cover medical bills for longtime employees' families and to send substantial, anonymous gifts to friends who had fallen on hard times, with strict instructions that her name never be mentioned. This suggests a sense of loyalty and compassion that the grand public persona could easily obscure. Perhaps the greatest myth is that she was always confident, that her ascent was effortless. The sheer scale and relentless frequency of her entertainments hint at something else, a deep-seated drive that may have sprung from that childhood insecurity. Throwing one magnificent ball could be for pleasure, but orchestrating a decades-long siege of spectacle feels like a compulsion, a need to constantly prove through visible triumph that she belonged. The woman behind the headlines likely carried that nervous energy of the outsider long after the world saw only a queen. So who was she? She was both the strategist and the artist, the wounded girl from San Francisco and the invincible hostess of Rosecliff. The legend was the tool she used to conquer a world, but the reality was the complicated, brilliant, and fiercely determined human being who wielded it. The story of Theresa Tessie Fair Oelrichs is a journey of astonishing transformation, a line drawn directly from the dark, echoing tunnels of a Nevada silver mine to the sunlit, ocean-facing ballrooms of Newport. She inherited a fortune forged in grit and controversy, a weight she could have simply carried through life as a quiet, wealthy woman. Instead, she chose to wield it like a master sculptor, chiseling a place for herself at the very peak of a world that had once looked down on her family. She was far more than a rich widow spending an inheritance. She was a visionary strategist who understood that in the Gilded Age, social power was the ultimate currency. and she had the capital to mint it herself. Through brilliant marriages, architectural audacity, and spectacles of pure imagination, she purified the raw ore of the Comstock Lode into a legacy of unquestioned supremacy. Today, Rosecliff still stands on the Rhode Island coast, no longer a private kingdom, but a public museum. Its heart-shaped staircase and grand ballrooms silent witnesses to the ambition of the woman who built them. It is a monument to a vanished era and to the singular force of will that was Tessie Oelrichs. Her life makes us wonder which figure from that dazzling, contradictory Gilded Age captures your imagination the most. Share your thoughts in the comments below.